I was raised to believe that color is a trust, not a possession. Every named hue in this world is held by a guild, sourced from one particular flower or beetle or mineral vein that only we know how to find, and we protect it the way you'd protect anything that could be lost forever if handled carelessly. Spent my whole career inside that belief without once turning it over to look at its underside. I want you to remember I said that before I tell you about the man who walked into my dye house asking about a color that does not exist. It was an ordinary Tuesday, if you can call any day ordinary that begins with your hands already stained to the second knuckle in gilt crimson. I'd been up since before light, testing a new mordant bath against a batch of madder root, and the whole workroom smelled the way it always smells: hot wool, vinegar, the faint mineral sharpness of a dye vat just starting to simmer. I remember thinking, in the last unremarkable moment of that morning, that I was exactly where I was always going to be: guild licensed, careful, content, or close enough to it that I'd stopped noticing the difference. He came in off the North Road, travel-worn, a restorer of old murals by trade, and he stood in my doorway describing something with his hands more than his words, a shifting, restless hue at the edge of things, never quite where he looked directly, that he swore he'd been seeing his whole life and had never once found a name for. He had the look of a man who'd walked a long way carrying something heavier than his satchel. "I need to know what's wrong with my eyes," he said. "Or what's wrong with everyone else's, for not seeing it too." I should have sent him to a physician. Guild business is guild business, and unnamed colors are by definition not our concern. We hold what's named and catalogued, nothing else. That is the first rule they teach you before you're even trusted near a dye vat. But something in the specific, exhausted precision of his description caught at me the way a flaw in a weave catches a trained eye. He wasn't describing madness. Madness doesn't have that kind of detail to it. He was describing a color the way I'd describe one I actually knew, the particular slant of it in low light, the way it seemed to recede exactly as fast as you tried to look straight at it. His name was Ansel Grey, which he told me with the dry, tired humor of a man who's made the joke about his own surname 1,000 times already. "Believe me," he said, "I've heard every version of the irony there is. Ansel Grey, colorblind to everything but the one color nobody else can see." My mother thought it was funny before she knew how it would turn out. I asked where he was from. He hesitated, genuinely hesitated, the particular pause of a man reaching for an answer that isn't quite where he left it, patting at a pocket he expects to be full and finding it strangely light. "A hill village," he said finally. "Small, you wouldn't know it." I asked its name anyway, out of habit more than suspicion, the same reflex that makes me ask a customer where their wool was sheared, out of professional courtesy rather than real curiosity. He told me, a name I'd never heard, plain and unremarkable sounding, 3 soft syllables that meant nothing to me at all, and I thought nothing of it until I mentioned it, in passing, to old Pharaoh at the archive desk that same afternoon, expecting nothing more than a shrug and a return to his ledgers. Pharaoh's face did something I have never seen a guild archivist's face do. Not confusion. Confusion has a shape, a furrowed brow, a request to repeat yourself, the ordinary friction of a fact, simply not yet known. This was something closer to a held breath, a mind visibly sliding off a fact, the way your eye slides off a smudge on old glass, unable to find purchase no matter how it tries. "I don't," he said, and stopped, and tried again, his pen hovering uselessly over the page. "I know that name. I know it." I can't seem to. He laughed, unsettled, covering it badly, the laugh of a man trying to make a small thing of something that has just frightened him. "Strange. Give me a moment. It'll come to me." It did not come to him. "Oh!" I watched Pharaoh Adair, a man who has never once in the 6 years I've known him failed to recall a single archived fact, stand at his own desk trying to remember the name of a village he'd just heard spoken aloud not 1 minute before, and fail completely, as though the words had been lifted clean out of his mind the moment they landed there, the way a hand lifts a stone from wet sand and leaves no mark of its ever having sat there at all. I looked back toward the doorway where Ansel Grey still stood waiting for an answer about his eyes, patient in the particular exhausted way of a man who has waited this long for an answer many times before and expects to be disappointed again. And I understood, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the dye house's cool stone floor, that I had just watched something be erased in front of me, in real time, deliberately, and that whatever was wrong with his sight, it was not madness at all. I did what any trained dyer does when faced with something that doesn't match a known pattern. I looked for the mundane explanation first. Pharaoh had been at the archives since dawn, I reasoned. Men forget things when they're tired, when a name is unusual, when a stranger's odd request has thrown the whole shape of an ordinary afternoon slightly off its axis. I told myself that twice, out loud, to Ansel, standing there in my doorway with his patient, disappointed face, and I watched him not believe me even slightly, because he'd clearly told himself that same story 100 times before and knew exactly how it ends. I used to think that too, he said. The first year, I catalogued every reasonable excuse for it myself. Tired listeners, ordinary forgetting, my own poor way of describing things. I stopped keeping the list somewhere around the second year. Once I noticed the pattern held no matter who I told, no matter how carefully I chose my words. It's never the listener's fault. I've made my peace with that part mostly. What I haven't made peace with is watching it happen to someone else's face instead of just hearing about my own. He said it without self-pity, which struck me more than if he'd said it bitterly, a man who had simply run out of room to be surprised by his own life. I went back to the archive desk after Ansel left to find lodging for the night, telling myself I only wanted to check on Pharaoh, make sure the strange episode hadn't unsettled him too badly. He was exactly as he always was, bent over his ledgers, precise, unbothered, already 3 tasks past the moment that had shaken him not an hour before. I asked him carefully whether he remembered our conversation about the village name. "Aye, what village?" he said, entirely without guile, entirely without the memory of having ever once struggled to hold it. Not evasive, not lying, genuinely, cleanly empty, the way a shelf is empty once whatever sat on it has been removed and the dust wiped carefully away behind it. That was the moment the professional curiosity in me turned into something colder and more personal. A man forgetting a strange name under stress is one thing. A man forgetting that he ever struggled to remember it at all, losing the memory of the forgetting itself, not just the fact underneath it, is something else entirely, something with a shape and an intention behind it that no ordinary tiredness could account for. I have spent my whole career trained to notice when something has been altered, a dye lot cut with cheaper pigment, a ledger entry adjusted after the fact, the small tells of a thing made to look more ordinary than it is. Pharaoh's blank, untroubled face was, I understood standing there in the archive's dim afternoon light, the most carefully altered thing I had ever seen, and nobody had touched a single page to do it. I locked the dye house later than usual that evening, the vat spanked down, the days madder red drying in careful rows I barely looked at on my way out. I found myself, instead of heading straight home, walking the long way past the inn where I knew Ansel had taken a room, telling myself it was only professional thoroughness, a guild dyer confirming a claim before dismissing it, nothing more. I did not entirely believe myself even as I thought it, and I have never been a woman who lies well to herself for long. I found him on the inn's front step, sketching by the last of the light the same restless economy of line in his hand that he'd used to describe the color that afternoon. He looked up before I'd said anything, as though he'd half expected me to come. "I'm not promising you an answer," I told him, plainly, because I thought he'd earned plain speaking after everything else the world had apparently given him instead. "I'm promising you I saw what I saw today, and I don't intend to pretend I didn't just because it would be easier for my own peace of mind." Something in his face loosened, careful and disbelieving, like a man unclenching a fist he'd forgotten he was making. "That's more than anyone's given me in 4 years," he said. "I'll take it." Part 2, tomorrow.